It's official, the Assassin's Creed Black Flag remake called Resynced is launching on July 9th, including on PC, and it looks like the game has been entirely rebuilt in the latest version of Ubisoft's Anvil engine, and that should come with tons of major graphical updates. There's also some gameplay changes. I will have the official post source in the video description, but this channel is mostly about PC stuff. So let's look at the graphical and technological enhancements, and then look at the PC system requirements. So they are saying that it is built from the ground up on the latest evolution of Ubisoft's proprietary Anvil engine used in Assassin's Creed Shadows. So Assassin's Creed Shadows looked really nice and it had a really interactive physics-based environment, all of that. So it was pretty impressive from a technical standpoint, although there is a performance cost that comes along with that. This does include ray-traced lighting with global illumination and reflections. Now, it does support a fallback for the lighting if you're on a GPU that doesn't have our hardware ray tracing acceleration. So like a GTX 1660 is listed as the minimum requirement. So you can run the game, and this is similar to Assassin's Creed Shadows, where there's a fallback for hardware that doesn't have ray traced acceleration. Now, they're saying optimized performance with 60 FPS options on consoles, but if you want to turn up some of the ray tracing features, etc. on consoles, they do drop below 60 FPS. And graphic assets are built from the ground up to support micro-polygon and physically based rendering pipelines. So micro-polygon is kind of like, I understand this has been pretty similar to what like Unreal Engine does with their nanite system, but this is, obviously not using Unreal Engine 5, this is using the Anvil engine. So it's the idea that it should be able to scale the level of detail pretty much with infinite accuracy as needed, rather than having like specifically popping in different levels of detail for those assets. And they will have a fully modernized water rendering and simulation. Also later, they mentioned things about like real-time time of day and weather effects and things like that, making the being out there on the sea have the Caribbean become a character in its own right. Anyway, the point is there is a lot more destructibility, physics, all sorts of things. So this does seem like a pretty major update to the game. It looks like it's really rebuilding stuff rather than just, doing a minor update to what was already there. And now we have the PC system requirements. Now, when we take a look at this, it's going to be important to notice a couple of things. Number one, I wish they had uploaded a higher resolution version of the system requirements list. It's a little bit pixelated looking. Other than that, though, I would say note that they are using upscaling in this chart. Now, at first I was going to be annoyed and say that they just said, oh, it's using dynamic resolution and then doesn't tell us, but then further down, it mentions the upscaler preset. So you can see that the minimum settings are for 1080p 30 FPS output at the low visual preset, but with balanced upscaling to hit that 1080p output. That's how I would read that. And to get there, they're saying that you could use a GTX 1660 or RX 5500 XT or Intel Arc A, not B, 580. Now, notice that they're kind of putting an asterisk on the standard ray tracing. So the idea here is that this would be software-based ray tracing or pre-computed lighting as a fallback compared to the hardware-accelerated ray tracing that you'd be using on the GPUs that are capable of doing that. Because the GTX 1660 and the RX 5500 XT are not capable of hardware-accelerated ray tracing. Now, if you're somebody who doesn't have one of the specific GPUs being listed, you might be like, well, where does that leave me? So another source I'll put in the video description is the Tech Power Up Relative Performance chart. In this, you click on the GPU that's listed in the systems requirements chart, like the GTX 1660, and now we can not only get information about that GPU, but we can see how it generally compares performance-wise to other GPUs. So the GTX 1660, like how does that compare to that 5500 XT? that we just saw listed next to? Well, generally the 5500 XT, according to this chart, is within about 88% of the performance. In other words, they're in a similar ballpark. Remember, systems requirements charts are not benchmarks saying that these get exactly the same performance. They're saying that they're going to fall roughly into the same performance tier, also in specific games and specific engines. Sometimes it would fall off of what is the typical result being shown in this chart. Where does Intel's A580 fall in this as well? Well, the A580 is generally about 43% more performant than the GTX 1660. So that's actually a pretty wide variance within GPUs in here. Now, that could mean that they perform similarly in this game, but like I said, it can also mean that there's just a lot of variance there, and these are the GPUs that they tested from NVIDIA, AMD, and Intel, and they were around 30 FPS at 1080p low settings. But it's possible that the weakest one here is like right barely hugging that 30 FPS average and falling below it. Whereas maybe something like the Arc A580 is actually more at like 40-ish FPS, but they would still put it in this general category. That's how we interpret system requirements charts. Now, notice they say that your CPU should also be at least in i7-8700K or Ryzen 5 3600. Ryzen 5 3600 is similar in gaming performance to what you'd get out of the CPUs in like a PlayStation 5 or an Xbox. So that's kind of, I think, why they're targeting that. Now, notice they're saying that could get you 30 FPS, but these CPUs would probably like be over 30 FPS. But in fact, the Ryzen 5 3600 is even still listed for 60 FPS. Although they're saying that the 8700K might not be good enough, and they're jumping up to a 10600K. So there's some questions on whether that 8700K is good enough for 60 FPS. Now, honestly, if the 3600 can get you to 60-ish FPS, I would imagine that this one's not too far off of that. But anyway, that's what we get out of the systems requirements chart. Now, it'll be nice to benchmark the game when it launches, but we can't do that yet. Now, if you want to get 60 FPS and move up from the low settings to the medium settings and now have standard ray tracing actually do hardware accelerated ray tracing, but you're still relying on balanced level upscaling to get there, they're now moving up to cards like the RTX 3060 12GB or an 8GB GPU should be fine because they're also listing the RX 6600 XT 8GB, and there's also the Intel Arc B580. So, if we go back to this 1660, which was our baseline before, we can now go up and see if we can find these GPUs. But also remember, your GPU could be somewhere in here. This is where you could spot yours if it's not one of the ones specifically being listed. So like if you have an RTX 3050, you're closer to the minimum spec rather than that recommended, 1080p 60 spec. If we climb, if you have a card like a 1080, that's actually, doing okay here, 2060. You're still short of the recommendation, but not by much. And now we're jumping up to, there's that 6600 XT and the RTX 3060 12GB. So that's about a 60-something% performance jump in order to double the frame rate and increase graphic settings. Interesting. So in other words, that to me is a sign that these cards that are listed at 30 FPS might actually be getting closer to 40-ish FPS, and then they're just not really getting you to 60. And so to get to 60, you don't need a true doubling of performance. That's how I would read this chart and how oftentimes system requirements charts work. Anyway, so that's getting you there. I'm going to set these as the baseline now so you can get an idea of what other GPUs would be similar in performance to cards like the 3060 12GB. Well, again, that 6600 XT that they listed is generally pretty neck and neck on performance. Although when ray tracing is involved, sometimes it falls further behind. Interestingly, these are listed as still being roughly similar performance in this game. The Arc B580 is generally more powerful than a 3060, but not by a lot. Here we're seeing about a 17% average performance increase. This would also be similar to if you had an RTX 5050 or an RTX 2080. Radeon RX 7600, 2070 Super, 1080 Ti, RK 770. These are all in this kind of ballpark, and you could kind of go down a little bit as well to like a 2070, RX 6600. You're in a similar kind of performance tier here. Okay, so what if you wanted to get 1440p 60 FPS at high visual preset, still using the standard ray tracing though, there is a higher setting. But now notice they're also reducing the reliance on upscaling. It's now going to quality level upscaling as opposed to balanced. And also with the higher output at 1440p, quality level upscaling from newer upscalers like DLSS 4, FSR4, quality level upscaling at 1440p generally looks really good. So less reliant on upscaling, higher output, higher graphic settings, still standard ray tracing. Now, one thing to note is they are asking for a higher end CPU, jumping up to the 11600K, which is generally not much more performant than the 10600K, but the Ryzen 5 5600X is generally noticeably faster than a 3600. So that is increasing that a little bit. So keep an eye on the CPU. We'll have to test it out in actual gameplay and see how important that is. But the GPUs are jumping up considerably to the 3080, which is a 10 gigabyte card, or the 6800 XT from AMD, which is 16 gigabyte card. So it looks like 10 gigabytes would be fine. Unclear if 8 would still be fine or not. Maybe these settings at this resolution is too much. Now, how does that go, performance-wise? Well, if we leave this 3060 as the baseline, we can go ahead and scroll up. Maybe you'll spot your GPU along the way, scrolling past cards like even a 2080 Ti or a 5060, past the 9060 XT, past the 3070 Ti, past the 5060 Ti even. Remember, the 3080 is getting a little old now, but it's still more raw performance than a 5060 Ti. So keep that in mind. It's also pretty neck and neck with cards like a 4070. So I'm going to set the 3080 as the baseline now. So the 3080, which was a pretty high-end GPU, but launched back in 2020, so it is getting to close to 6 years old now at this point. But like I said, it's a bit older, but still very competitive with a 4070. Even a 4070 Super is not much more powerful. The 3080 Ti wasn't even that much more powerful either, and even the 3090 wasn't that much more powerful. So back in the 30 series, the 80 class cards were near the top of the line. The 90 class wasn't much more powerful, so do keep that in mind. Even new cards like the 5070 aren't that much more powerful. Same thing with like a 4070 Ti. And 9070, okay, we're starting to get into like 26% more powerful, but we're not like worlds apart here. So that's the kind of performance we're talking about when we talk about a 3080. Also, pretty close performance with the 7800 XT and a 6800 XT. Remember, the 6800 XT was the one that was actually listed. Now, 6800 XT generally is pretty close to the performance of a 3080 when there's not heavy ray tracing involved. There's some ray tracing involved here, but they're still listing them in the same class. That's a sign that it's probably not like super demanding ray tracing. And the big downside to the 6800 XT here would be that it doesn't support FSR4. Now, the game does, but this card doesn't. So that's kind of the downside here. Cards like a 9060 XT 16 gigabyte would be a little bit less raw performance, but usually better when ray tracing is involved. That might catch up, and then you'd have that FSR4 support, so you wouldn't be too far off here. So those are the kinds of GPUs we'd be thinking about for 1440p high settings with the standard ray tracing and quality upscaling involved. The biggest advantage for the 3080 here, I think, being that with upscaling involved, newer DLSS versions are going to put in a lot of work here from a image quality perspective. Now that brings us to the extreme setting. Now they jump all the way up to 4K 60 at the ultra preset, jumping up from high to ultra, and the ray tracing is going from standard to extended. I believe the extended ray tracing is where they start getting the ray traced reflections, and I think some of the other features could be higher quality and stuff like that too. So there's a lot jumping up here. Now they're jumping all the way to a 4090 or a 7900 XTX. Whoa, okay, first of all, that's a bit of a weird pairing, especially when we're talking about heavy ray tracing involved. And they're also mentioning only quality upscaling, which at 4K Honestly, oftentimes I would go to balanced or performance mode, especially if we're talking about newer upscalers like DLSS 4 or FSR 4. So there's a lot of room to upscale more aggressively here. So I would say that if you don't have these, but you were planning on playing at 4K, I mean, maybe upscale a little more aggressively and slightly turn down the ray tracing, and you're probably going to be fine. Now, let's also look at this pairing, 7900 XTX versus 4090, if we look at that performance-wise. Okay, so we got the 3080 as the baseline. Let's go up. We can see we're passing cards like the 4070 Ti, 9070, 9070 XT, and then that's getting into pretty close performance to a 7900 XTX. So I'm going to set that as the baseline now. Now the 7900 XTX, 24 gigabyte card, it is very powerful. It came out in 2022, near the end of the year. Now, this raw performance-wise is within the same ballpark as newer GPUs from AMD, like the 9070 XT, newer GPUs like the 5070 Ti. These are all in the same kind of performance tier. Same thing as like a 4080 or 4080 Super. Even the 5080 wasn't a big performance jump here, so we're not too far off that performance ballpark. Notice the 4090, though, is a bit of a jump, generally 30% more powerful. And that's usually in rasterized performance. Ray tracing would usually push its lead even further. So that's what I'm saying about this being, this being a little bit of an odd pairing for the 4090 against that 7900 XTX. Now, sometimes AMD GPUs kind of overperform in certain games. Sometimes Assassin's Creed games are even one of those. So that could be related, but again, this is with pushing the ray tracing features. So I just find that a little bit of an unusual pairing. Now there's some other good news as kind of minor notes. Dedicated handheld presets. So if you're planning on playing on a handheld, there could probably be some like lower than low settings that can be enabled to make this run well on like a Steam Deck, that kind of a thing. They do mention ultra wide resolution support as well as HDR, and they do mention a built-in benchmark tool. So you can bet that I will be running this through some benchmarks on a variety of hardware at launch. And so good stuff. They're mentioning all the latest upscalers, including XeSS 3 as well as FSR 4 and DLSS 4.5. So we should have all that kind of support we're looking for. Now, as just kind of a minor note at the end here, I'll say that these are the Assassin's Creed Shadows PC system requirements, which we could kind of look at as a comparison point. Since Black Flag is being done on that same engine, and is another, recent release. So comparison-wise, there are definitely some differences. I actually think overall, it kind of looks like Shadows was asking for more. Like if you look at the 1080p 60 FPS medium settings, this was a 3060 Ti and a 6700 XT, whereas on the Black Flag Resynced, we're seeing a 3060 non-Ti and a 6600 XT, which is actually a pretty big performance difference if you want to look at the relative performance there. Like the 3060 is a pretty big step down from the 3060 Ti from raw performance standpoint. Now it gets more VRAM, but the 3060 Ti is like 30% faster. So, and the 6700 XT is kind of up there as well. So, in other words, it does look like, according to the system requirements, at least at certain settings, it could be the case that Black Flag Resynced is more performant than Assassin's Creed Shadows, but system requirements charts aren't the same thing as benchmarks. So, that would be an interesting thing to look at once we actually get the game. In order to benchmark, but just interesting to note. Another thing I'll note is that the storage is 65 gigabytes, which, while it's not nothing, is smaller than a lot of recent releases. Notice games like Assassin's Creed Shadows was asking for more storage space. Did they not actually list it here, though? Huh, interesting. But anyway, it was definitely more than that. Like a lot of games these days are pushing like 100 gigabytes plus. So at least that's not an insane storage size. All they are saying SSD is required. Now you could probably still play the game on a hard disk, but you might see issues with load times or assets not streaming in properly and potentially some hitching when that's the case. All right, let me know what you guys think in the comments section, and I hope all of you have an excellent day.